Welcome to another episode of Journeys of Hope. Today I have a really exciting guest. She has been on the previous cruise. She is an author, and she is really, I believe, changing the world of grief. So thank you and welcome, Shelby.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Now, Shelby, I kind of like my guests to tell their grief story as opposed to me telling it. So if you were to, tell your grief story, what is your grief story?
Well, one of my favorite people, and actually somebody who joined us on the bereavement cruise before, Linda Sheldon-Fell, describes my grief story as coming out the other side of 4 years of hell. And that's pretty much exactly how I describe it. So I had a very idyllic childhood where there was very little grief or trauma or how do I phrase this, like disruption. Like it was very, very stable and very, very peaceful. We lived in the suburbs. I had piano lessons and slumber parties and all these other things. um, and then all of a sudden when I went off to college, it was just like all of these losses happened in very, very quick succession, and each one seemed like it was worse than the next. And these included my dad losing his job, and so that was a loss of stability for our family. He started having seizures and was diagnosed with 2 identical brain aneurysms, one on either side of his head. So all of a sudden, I was reckoning with his mortality and the possibility that he might die. And then I came out of the closet as a queer woman and developed an eating disorder because of all of the crazy things that were going on in my family at the time. And then in 2012, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. And this was right as my dad was coming out of his surgeries, and we thought we were done with medical craziness and visits to Duke Hospital and all these other things in North Carolina. She got the news that she had breast cancer, and within about a year and a half, she died. And it was just 4 years of, I've described it on other interviews or other podcasts as like I'm laying on this rock and the ocean's just pounding and pounding and pounding and pounding relentlessly. And then when my mom finally died, it's like this huge wave came and just sucked me under with it. And there was no way I could possibly see the surface from that. And it was just unrelenting. And in the midst of all this, I should preface, I'm 27 years old now. I was 21 when she died. I was going to college and working 3 jobs and falling in love for the first time and all the things you're supposed to do when you're away at school. And so balancing the dichotomy of all of that, like the 4 best years of your life with the 4 worst years of my life, was essentially the what my lost story looked like on the outside.
Wow. Yeah, there's a whole lot there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Um, so when I listen to your story though, and I listen to you tell it now, it's clear to me that you have a very different vision of it today than the day that you were living through all of this. You have a joy about you now, and you have a peace about you now. And I know you've written about that. So what is the name of your book again?
It's called Permission to Grieve.
And if people want to get that, where would they get that?
Oh, it's all available on Amazon. It's a paperback format, so if you like a hard copy that you can write and highlight in, I love people sending me pictures of the passages that they actually write in the book, and an ebook as well. So if you're going on vacation or something like that, it's really helpful to take on the plane with you. And the audiobook should be coming soon, within the next 2 or 3 weeks or so.
No, I love that. When I read Permission to Grieve, one of the things I liked about it was you shared kind of the darkness of where you were.
Yeah.
And kind of, because when you tell your grief story right now today, it's in a very different place. So if someone was in that dark place today, what would you say to them?
Oh, let it out, I think, because in in my own world, I suppose I had this perception of how grief was supposed to look at the time. And so as my mom was dying, I would lock myself in the cab of my dad's truck that was parked in the garage, and I would just scream and rail and hurl curse words at doctors and myself and God and all these other things. And after that was over, I kind of shut down for about a year and a half until this random day when my wallet was stolen in downtown Chicago where I live. And then it was just like, for some reason, that opened up that same wound of grief and grieving and loss and being taken from all over again. And I had this moment where I collapsed on my apartment floor and started screaming and yelling and hurling curse words and and all these other things. But I had not done anything like that for like a year and a half, 2 years, because I thought that letting my pain out or my grief out would break me or classify me as crazy or or just destroy me in some capacity. And it was so hard to just be alive, that to be alive and grieving simultaneously was like too impossible for my brain to comprehend. So if you're in a space that's like really, really dark, allow yourself to sink in and express being in the dark place. And it's so hard to hear from somebody who's not also in a dark place themselves, because it's almost like it's a different language that you speak when you're in that darkness. And for me, that language was rage and fury and desperation and isolation and abandonment, even though, and this story comes up a lot of I know they didn't mean to die, they didn't mean to leave me here, my mom didn't mean to leave me alone, but in her death it was a form of abandonment for me as her child. And to be angry about that and to be righteous about that, and why did you leave me here alone, like it doesn't have to be. I think there's so much pressure for grief to be logical or justified, and it really doesn't have to be. It's all a heart matter. And so expressing from here, as opposed to trying to express from a mental place or a logical place, is is really, really helpful. I wish somebody would have told me that while I was grieving, is that I had that permission, which I write about, permission to grieve, to express from my heart, as opposed to trying to logic my way out of grieving.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Americans, we really like everything to fit in a nice, neat box. We like to be able to put our bow on it and, have it show up in the Macy's window. That's what we want our lives to be. And I think that, that kind of illusion that maybe is portrayed by, kind of our culture and our society plays itself out in grief. And grief is not pretty. It can be really ugly. But allowing yourself to recognize that it doesn't have to make sense. It's about where you're at, and whatever you're at, you're feeling it, and allowing yourself to feel that. And I think, some of the examples that you give in the book, I think are really good, because I think all too frequently people look at things like, being on the floor and breaking down. And as you just said there was a fear of maybe that you would be stuck in that place. And, I would echo what you're saying. If somebody's feeling that, go ahead and do it, because the reality is you're not going to get stuck in that place. You may not believe it right now, but I promise you, if you feel what you feel, there is a way out of it. Even if you aren't ready to find that today, and just be where you're at, wherever that is. And so I think that makes a lot of sense.
One of my favorite things that my grief recovery specialist trainer taught me as I was going through grief recovery training was that nobody cries forever, because she's like, I see people over and over again, and you'll see clients too, is when you start to take them, have this fear of expressing for fear that it will go on forever. And I think part of that is because loss itself is so permanent. So we think that because the death of a loved one is so permanent, that everything that comes after that must be permanent too, because our life has been forever changed. But it's physiologically impossible, it's physically impossible to cry forever. And so many of the emotions that are related to grief, like rage and like anguish and like despair, are these short fuse burning emotions where once they're out, they're kind of all burned up. There's no more matter left to work with, for lack of better phrasing, and you get to move on to the next emotion that's coming your way, whether it's sadness or nostalgia or just a space to breathe, or joy even. So it comes, I've learned it comes in waves, and it's a lot less predictable than I thought it would ever be. Certainly less predictable than I thought it would be before my mom died.
Yeah. You have another, I guess, area that I'd like to discuss a little bit about. As you mentioned, you had just come out as queer right before your mom died, or was it right after? I don't remember the exact timing, but it was right
It was
around
before, probably about 2 or 3 years before.
2 or 3 years before. So you were still kind of coming to grips with that. And how did you find that affected your grief journey? Was there any interactivity between that journey and your grief journey? And if so, what was it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. Um, so I came out to my family, and we lived in suburban North Carolina, and I grew up going to church and all this other stuff. So I knew that it wasn't going to be received well, but I didn't necessarily know what the outcome of it was going to be. And essentially, what I was told by both my parents and even some extended family was like, we love you, but we don't accept this. And to me, as coming out of the closet as an 18, 19-year-old woman, that sounded like we love you, but we don't love you. Like love and acceptance were exactly the same thing in my brain. And so I could not comprehend or understand how that was possible. And actually, probably about 2 months before she died, a month or two before she died, my mom and I had this really big fight in a mall in North Carolina. And we were in a wedding dress store, and I was just thumbing through the racks and looking around and not seriously purchasing anything. I was not engaged by any means, but she asked me if I was considering getting married to the girl that I was dating in college. And I said, yeah, we've talked about it, and we'd been together for over a year, and, things were getting more serious, and we were planning a vacation and things like that together. And she looked at me and she really softly said, it wasn't aggressive in the slightest, but she said, if you do decide to marry her, your father and I won't be there. And in that instant, I just deflated. Like everything about me just went down. And she and I ended up having this really tear-filled fight in the middle of this mall in Charlotte, North Carolina, like around Black Friday. And so there were all these shoppers around, and she and I were sitting in tears on this bench together. She was sitting to my right in the mall, and just having this like almost a hissing conversation through our teeth. And I was coming at her with these ideas of logic, and you don't agree with this about the Bible, and yet you wear mixed fibers and you eat shellfish and you cut your hair and all these other things. I don't understand why you're picking and choosing what's applicable in the Bible. And she was like, I don't want you to go to hell. I don't understand this lifestyle choice you're making. I don't understand how this could be you. We didn't see this coming. And so essentially I tell people that she died while we were in the middle of a fight. And so where a lot of my family, I presumed, got to be allowed to be just sad when she died, I was sad and angry, because we never got to. There's a Dr. Brene Brown talks a lot about how there's 3 steps to kind of wrestling with identity or changes in your life. The first one is the rumble, the second one is the reckoning, and the third one is the rising. And so the rumble is kind of that tussling, getting all the wires crossed and mixed together and the messages out. The reckoning is kind of where you come to terms with what's happening and you really lay down some foundation work. And the rising is where you come out of it into a new life, whatever that is, with this new definition intact. And we were still rumbling when she died. We never got to this reckoning stage with each other where we got to really, for lack of better phrasing, like lay down the law, either agree to disagree, or one of us turn around or get through to the other person or what have you. And so my grief journey has been really tainted by that, affected by that, because I wonder what would have happened if she died, I don't know, 4 years later, 5 years later, because in the time since she's died, other members of my family, including my dad and my sister and our extended relatives, have come around and really accept and embrace me and the people I choose to bring home to introduce to them, and all this other stuff. And I never got that acceptance or recognition or just this full body seeing from her. I see you as the person you are sexually and as my daughter as well. And I feel kind of ripped off by that. And so it definitely informs my grief. And so when I see people out, especially on Mother's Day or around the holidays or big holidays, and I see like girls with their moms, I'm like, oh, I miss that mother-daughter connection, but I also see them together, and I wonder what's going to happen if and when that daughter ever comes out of the closet to her mom. I'm like, will you be accepted before she dies? And so I almost project my story onto other people, which I think is something that's really common in grief, but it just kind of lives up there. It's not as loud as it used to be, because I think the more that I've gone on and grieved, the more I've tried to put myself in her shoes. And she thought with everything in me that her fighting me and my sexuality was saving my life, saving her baby from an eternal life in hell. And recognizing that like mother bear instinct about her has given me more compassion for why she chose to speak to me the way that she did. And then vice versa, I look at myself, I was like, I was 19 years old and feeling really righteous about who I was in the world. And when I was going to show up, I was going to show up, and everybody else, can go to where. And so I think if we had each been in different places, it would have turned out differently, or the conversation would have gone in a different direction. But I'll never know. And I think that really, really impacts my grief in a way.
So it sounds like you're saying, though, that with your understanding of how she saw the world, that to her understanding of that, what she was doing was really expressing her knowledge of love, not that it was that it had its own definitions and its own barriers around it, but under her belief structure, she was loving you to the best of her ability by what it was she was saying then. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's about right. And there's a beautiful podcast that I just got interviewed for called What She Wishes You Knew. And it's about bridging the divide on contentious issues within the Christian community. And I came on as a guest and talked about this. And we had a whole conversation about this phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, and how much, at least I kind of spoke on behalf of the queer community. I don't know if I'm even allowed to do that, but I said, you know what that feels like is just a bypassing of really seeing who we are and who we show up as, because I feel like there is no love without acceptance. And yeah, that was really hard to reckon with. But at the same time, she was doing the best she could with the tools she had at the time while she was living. I just wish, like with everything in me, I mean, I had 2 more years. I would give anything to just have 2 more years to see what else we could iron out with that conversation. I would have loved more than 2, but if even 2 more was all I got, that would have been incredible.
That paradox that you're speaking of, I think, is something that so many people struggle with because, as you said, if you had 2 more years, who knows what it would have been. Yet at the same time, you can understand and see her actions as being loving. So you can both accept them and not accept them at the same time, both realize that they're there and not. And that
Yeah,
paradox is all too frequently part of the reality of grief. And I think for other people that are probably, you've shared your unresolved struggle, but I think all too frequently people have unresolved struggles with the loved one that died, that because of death is final, there is no, it's now a one-way struggle. You can't find out what would have happened because they're not here. Um,
right.
so let's switch gears a little bit. You were on our last grief cruise with us, and I really appreciated you going. You added a lot to it. I loved having you there, and I loved you're talking about some of the pieces of grief that people don't realize that they've lost, but they did. And
Mm-hmm.
with that, though, I kind of want to ask you a question. When you first heard about two words together, maybe they're a paradox too, or at least a lot of people tell me they are, and that is grief and cruise go together. What was your first thoughts when you heard about it?
I think the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, that's so cool. Who thought of that? Because I would never put them together myself. Like the idea of putting a bunch of grieving people on a boat and then the boat like sails away was just never something that entered my mind. But I was familiar because of the work that I do with things like grief retreats or like going somewhere else to focus on grief. And so at least that was familiar to me. But grief on a cruise ship, I was like, that's a great idea. Who thought of that? And so instantly I wanted to meet you, to be in touch with it, because I was like, there's got to be some mind behind that somehow put those pieces together, and there's a whole story there.
Well, I'm excited that you came. So after you came on it, so you kind of came on it with a kind of an excited attitude. Now that you've been on it, what would you say to someone who is kind of thinking about going on it? If you were to describe, how would you describe the week?
I tell people it's exactly what you expect, and it's not exactly what you expect, which is really fun, because what I expected of the bereavement cruise was that there would be a lot of community spaces, so conversations about loss that would be happening pretty much the minute that you entered the room. Of course, by invitation, so you're never obligated to talk about a loved one, but so things like the nights of remembrance or the candle lighting ceremonies or things like that were really what I was expecting to see on the bereavement cruise, with the addition of things like yoga in the morning, or the inspiration photo walks on the upper deck where we would take pictures and kind of honor watching the sun come up and go down every night. Things like that I definitely was expecting. And having led workshops in other spaces, I kind of thought I knew what those would feel like. But conversely, the content of the workshops and just like the variety across the spectrum that we got on there was really, really cool. And I got the good fortune of being able to sit in on quite a few of them, um, including ones about like grief that speaks to what happens mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, like kind of in these 4 facets ways. There were other workshops about really deep self-compassion in the ways that we choose to talk to ourselves in the aftermath of loss that were really, really powerful. And I was not expecting that at all. And then these really cool performances too. I was not expecting a musical component, but one of our guests came on and did like interpretive signing to music that was related to loss. And I thought that was really beautiful. And I just didn't expect that either. And so, oh, and the craft part, that was my favorite. On Saturday, there was a photo shoot, which I knew was going to be there, where you could write sayings about grief on your arms and have your photo taken. But the craft bit too, where you kind of got to sit around and make things with other people. And I just thought that was so neat. So part of it was totally things I was expecting, and then part of it was totally not. And I knew to expect. What's neat is that I'd been talking about the bereavement cruise on my podcast for over 6 months before I went. And then to go on it, I knew some people to expect to see. But the first night, this woman walked up to me and she said, I've been listening to your podcast on YouTube since my husband died. And I've been listening to your show for over a year, and I don't know how to listen to podcasts, but I found it on YouTube, which is how I found you. And that's why me and my friend are here. And I was like, oh my gosh. And so it was just so cool to be with somebody who I even had no idea was coming. So it was a really neat combination. I mean, you talk about two things happening at the same time in grief. There's the things that you expect to happen on the bereavement cruise, and then the things that you don't. And then, of course, I had been on cruise ships before, and so I knew to expect the other cruise amenities, like going to see shows and dinner in the dining hall every night, and all of the different kind of performances that were happening on the ship, which were really cool. And actually, believe it or not, one of the jazz trios that was performing on the fourth deck, I'm still in touch with today for one of my day jobs that is a restaurant that frequently plays jazz. So I think they're going to come do a gig with us soon.
Wow.
So it was really neat. Unexpected connections everywhere.
Yeah, I think I love the fact that it was everything you expected and everything you didn't at the same time. I love that. I think that's a great definition. So one of the concerns that some people have, though, is that we do mix types of grief. We have people who are widows and widowers and lost children and lost their parents, et cetera, different things of that nature. And that's kind of, in my experience, unique. Most grief conferences tend to focus on either a specific kind of loss, like suicide or murder or something of that nature, or they focus on loss of a parent or loss of a child or loss of a spouse. But we kind of mix it all together. How did you find that experience, kind of coming from the younger perspective and losing your mom and things of that nature? How did you find that mix of people?
I think I needed that. And I'll tell you why. Part of it's probably because of the workshop that I led to, but I think people, they know about certain losses and they don't know or haven't named other ones that have happened in their life. So for somebody to come on board and say, I'm here because I lost my husband or my grandson or whoever, and to really be able to identify that loss is important. But then there's other things that we lose too, like our identities and our sense of self and our home or our role as a caregiver, or all these other things that can happen as a result of loss. And those are the things that we're going to have in common with people, regardless of who the person was, like what their role was or relationship was to us who we lost. So I appreciated that. And also, I connected with people who lost a parent on the bereavement cruise, but very often as a motherless daughter, I tend to connect with uh, childless mothers or mothers who have lost a child. And so people who have, I don't know if you'd call it the opposite loss of me, I find a lot of connection there, not in a codependent sense where we become that person for each other, but the mother-child connection, like you just know what that kind of devastation feels like. And there were quite a few mothers on board who lost children. And so for me to speak to them as someone who'd lost a mother, that instant connection was formed. And I'll say that instant connection was formed with everybody who came on the cruise too. Like when you spoke your loss out loud and they spoke theirs, there was like this moment of, oh yeah, I see you. That hurts like hell. Because I don't believe that, yes, there are some conversations that can only happen in different circles, which is why things like the circles of hope every night were important, that were classified with each different type of loss. So loss of a parent, loss of a spouse, loss of a child, etc. So you could be one-on-one with these people who had experienced the exact same loss that you could, but there's also just that universal component of loss of I have lost something, I've lost something too. And then you can connect over that. Yeah. I don't personally feel a need to do a heck of a lot of division in the grief sphere because loss is loss is loss is loss in my mind.
I personally believe that too. And I think you kind of alluded to one of the, I think the gifts that is there. People come on board because they have lost whoever, their son, they lost their spouse. But then I think of those other losses that they have not really honored maybe as much as they thought they had and not really dealt with them on the level they are. It amazes me how they came on board for this person. And then when they are, we're doing our ceremonial burial at sea, they put all of these other names down, and you start to realize that there's all of these other people that maybe they still have pieces of themselves, and I think it's just very healing to have that event. So yeah, I appreciate your sharing your perspective there. So I want to let you have the final word, and that is, if someone asked you, said, Shelby, I'm thinking about going on the cruise, but I'm not sure, what would you tell them?
Go. Just one word, go. I've had a lot of people actually come on the podcast, my podcast, as guests and say, I want to know how I can get on. And I said, do you mean as a presenter? And some of them will say, yes, I want to know if I can speak on the bereavement cruise. And others are just like, no, I just want to learn how to go. Because it sounds like such a novel experience. I say, first of all, just go on the cruise, because if you've never taken a cruise in your life, it's an absolute blast. But go also if you feel like you are missing or aching for community surrounding grief in your life, go. If you've never really taken time off of your life or off the grid to look at your grief, go. And if you feel like, and this gives me chills to say, because this was what was true for me, is like, if you feel like your grief just needs a rest, like just needs to take a break, go. Because I think so often we feel like we're trying to balance grief among all the other things we have going in our lives, and we're spinning plates up in the air. And this was just a really powerful opportunity for be like, okay, grief is going to be my focus for the week. That's all I'm here to do. That's all I have to do. Everything else is entirely optional. I can get on the boat, I can get off the boat. I can go to this, place and have this meal, or I could not go to that place and have that meal. I could see that show, I could not see that show. But literally my only job for the week was to show up and tell my grief story over and over and over again. And that in and of itself is a really nice place for grief to be able to take a breath and create space. And that goes all the way back to my book, Permission to Grieve, which is about creating grace and space and room to breathe in the midst of loss, and designating specific time, like setting aside time, whether it's the 4-day trip or the week-long trip, whichever bereavement cruise you go on, setting aside specific time to have a relationship with your grief is just really, really cool and really, really important too.
Yeah, thank you. So if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that?
Yeah, so the absolute best way is at shelbyforsythia.com, and you can find the book there, you can find the podcast there. I lead a couple of different grief communities online there as well, including ones kind of like this where it's video conference grief support once a month, and so that's a lot of fun. And that's shelbyforsythia.com, and if you want to send an email right away, it's shelby@shelbyforsythia.com, and I love hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much, Shelby. I really appreciate everything. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Absolutely.